Thank you very much. It's very good to be here. And I did have a conversation with Richard earlier in the week, and we were talking about analogies for this. And he was saying, well, what analogy could I use for being a subject leader? And I thought, I thought Bake Off. That you sometimes have a technical, and sometimes you have a showstopper, but you have the resources there, and you have some of your skills to try and mix everything together. And sometimes it looks amazing, other times it's sort of disastrous. But there's a real sort of human empathy with that. And I thought, off the top of my head, I thought that wasn't a bad analogy. And then Richard comes up with his I don't know. That seems to me that's absolutely impossible. Maybe for Richard, he does juggle Rubik cubes in the evening when he comes off an inspection. But I mean that's pretty impressively demanding, isn't it? I'm going to stick with Bake Off and think that perhaps sometimes your curriculums will look magnificent and sometimes they won't quite work. So that maybe that's a slightly more humane model than we were just presented with. But I mean, it's always fantastic to hear Richard talking with his passion for the subject and his inside experience and knowledge of it as well. Always a real challenge too. So my title that I've been given here, it made me think that I'm not going to actually construct your curriculums for you, and that's because, of course, it's your curriculum. I mean, Ben mentioned yesterday about that his curriculum is his curriculum. He's protective of it. He loves it. He doesn't want to sort of hand it over to other people to mess it up. And so you're responsible. And Richard talked just then about your responsibility to take those decisions about curriculum for yourselves. I think that's one of the fantastic things in the last few years is about handing that responsibility back to curriculum leaders rather than to have something that's just presented to them. So I'm not going to be writing your or developing your RE curriculum. You're going to have to do that. What I'm going to do is offer 7 questions, if you like, actually 6 questions and a comment as a way of offering points of reflection. So they're not rules, it's not a code, more your kind of guidelines to quote an old film. So I'm not going to claim any great originality either. This is the result of my own experience, but also conversations with people and reading some of the same stuff that you've been reading as well. And I know that a lot of you will have been thinking about this. And so it may well be that you've heard some of this sort of thinking already, but I hope that there's at least one thing that you might get from what I say. So 6 questions and a comment. Here's my first, actually a pair of questions. So to think about the pupil's experience of this, I remember reading, back in 2007, Mary Hayward, who was doing a PhD at Warwick at the time, produced this paper about Christianity and RE at Key Stage 3. And she talked about how pupils' experience of the teaching of Christianity within Key Stage 3 led to, and this was the phrase I noted, was atomized RE. That was the experience of pupils. They saw a unit here, a unit there, but didn't see any connection between them or any link with them. And so, of course, it is really possible to create a curriculum where you've got sort of a random selection of units, perhaps from an agreed syllabus or from your own devising, that might be based on the idea of coverage and the idea of aggregate that we've heard about from Richard and Christine, about all the big religions, festivals and philosophy. And so you might do that, but of course it won't be surprising that pupils' experience of that is of it being atomized and unconnected. They look at what they're doing this term and they think, what's this got to do with what we were doing before half term? And there's no connection. So of course they don't see anything. I think it's equally possible to write a very sophisticated curriculum which has really deepened and carefully thought through connections that you see as your expert with your anthropology or philosophy or sociology or religious studies degree. But actually if pupils don't see that themselves, then it's atomized for them anyway. It's this idea then of thinking about how the pupils are going to see this. I think that ties in with Christine's talk there about a narrative. When I started teaching my second school, I started developing a unit on Christianity in the first couple of terms because I wanted pupils to have a good grounding, which would mean that when they encountered other stuff about Christianity later on, they would know what we were talking about. So we looked at 9 concepts in Christian Old Testament in the first term, and then how Christians might see their fulfillment in the New Testament in the second term. So creation and fall and sacrifice and atonement, that sort of thing. So when they looked at ideas of Jesus, for example, they could see how Christians might interpret his death and resurrection in terms of sacrifice and atonement. So, when I first started RE Today, that's what became the Bible, the Big Story, which I know one or two of you will have seen. But the idea with that was that pupils have a really good grounding of some of those big words, those big concepts. And then as we looked at other traditions as well, when we got back to year 9, I did a unit that looked at ideas of God through art, which drew on art from different traditions to try to see how they could show their interpretation. They could read the artwork, if you like. For example, when they came across Zerberans, Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, they understood what that represented because of that background that they'd had in ideas of sacrifice, Old Testament sacrifice, and ideas of Jesus' death as a sacrifice. The idea that you're building that coherence for pupils. So that's my that's mine. That's to tell me to report on the COVID Zoe tracker, to do that every day. Anyway, so but that idea of seeing, and then if pupils know this in year 9, then it's really good basis for Key Stage 4, GCSE, and then on to A level as well. So, asking that question, what is your pupils' experience of this? How does it make sense to them? A second question is about what does your curriculum reveal and conceal? So Richard's already mentioned David Lewin. David Lewin's really excellent chapter on religion, reductionism, and pedagogical reduction in Pat Hallam's book. In there, David talks about reductive frameworks. He talks about reductive frameworks. He says, are not simply true or false, but they show something while obscuring something else. Okay, and so you might think about actually whether the world religions paradigm, what it shows and what it obscures. David talks about how some people can reduce religion to make sense of it. They might reduce it by applying interpretive frameworks in terms of the physical, so how neurochemistry might say something about religion, or they might talk about religion in terms of power. Think about Marxist sort of critique of things as well. So that's what he means when he says it's not simply true or false. It's just that when you focus in and zoom on one aspect, then other things go out of focus. So that idea about showing something and revealing something. He also talks, and I was just thinking about this morning when Richard was talking, he also has this lovely quote from Robert Macfarlane, the guy who writes about wild woods and underground. He talks about reduction is not a perimeter that restricts, but an aperture, a space through which the world can be seen. And that idea that we have to restrict, we have to reduce for our curriculum, but rather than seeing it as, oh my goodness, I can't pack everything in, it's like thinking, how am I going to help pupils to look through it into this world? So that an aperture, a space through which the world can be seen. That's an encouraging line, I think, from David Lewin quoting Robert Macfarlane. So any curriculum is going to be a simplification, it's going to be a reduction, but that's okay, all right? That can still be this aperture. So it's worth asking, what picture of religion, non-religion worldviews, what picture is it that your curriculum reveals and conceals? And there, again, the language of representation. What is the representation of religion that's presented through your curriculum, and what does it reveal and what does it conceal? So it may be that my preference for getting pupils into texts, for getting them to wrestle with philosophical questions, may reveal something of the richness of narrative, the richness of interpretive traditions through time in some religions. But by default, by omission, if you like, that approach will then conceal the lived experience in the lives of individuals and communities through rituals and through festivals, for example. And I always had to be careful with my curriculum that I didn't just spend all the time looking at the sort of texts, sources of authority, and questions of philosophy. I had to do some of the practice as well. So David quotes Heidegger, every revealing is a concealing. So what is your curriculum revealing and concealing? And then third question, pair of questions really, is connected to that. I mean, I've hinted at this already. So my enjoyment of text might skew my curriculum, right? But is there anything else in my worldview, my personal worldview, that might present itself in my choices of curriculum, in your choices of curriculum, in your choice of questions to explore or content to use, examples to use? There's obviously this growing discourse about the importance of personal worldviews in RE, the idea that we should really help pupils to develop their personal worldviews, to become more self-aware about their own perspective, their own assumptions, how that shapes their encounters with the content in the classroom, but actually with anything else. So personal worldviews goes beyond the RE classroom. It's an academic goal as well. If you think PhD students have to spend quite a lot of time thinking about their position, their positionality, where do they stand, and what impact is that going to have on their research, so they can take account of it rather than be blind to it. So if we're asking pupils to grow in awareness, then I think we have to be more aware of our own worldviews as well. So for me, it might be to do with what I select for curriculum books for NATRE, but for you, obviously, it's going to be what you select for your curriculum as well. So if I look at your curriculum outlines, what can I see about your own worldviews? What shows up in the way that you have constructed those? So I just want to give an example back from 2010 from the work of Lynn Revel, Rosemary Walters, and Hazel Bryan. So they were looking at what used to be called RE student teachers. And they asked them about their beliefs and their position and how that affected their teaching. And their research shows that most of the Christian RE student teachers saw that their faith position was actually problematic for them. They thought, I have to be careful about what I express in the classroom if I shared my beliefs, for example, with my pupils, because that might influence them, and that is potentially unprofessional. So Lynn Revel and colleagues found that the atheist agnostic student teachers actually saw that their non-religiousness, their questions about the validity of faith, was actually a positive contribution to the RE lesson. And so their conclusion, or one of their conclusions in the research, is that pupils should see, teachers should see, student RE teachers should see, a secular atheist or agnostic belief position in the classroom should be recognized by all students and student teachers as an identifiable belief position rather than as a neutral stance. Now, I would like to think we've moved on in 10 years, particularly around awareness of the impact of worldviews, our own worldviews on how we present in the classroom or in any other way. Although I do recall talking to a teacher on our New to RE program just a couple of years ago in the last conference we had before the pandemic. And this teacher talking about how he had talked to his pupils, that the story of Jesus was bonkers. All right, and that then the story of Muhammad was a natural response to the religious and cultural environment of his time. Now, that's a pretty extreme example, but that's somewhat unreflective imposition of your worldview in how you present something in the classroom. So we all do have a worldview. We all have a position. And the implications are, for you in terms of curriculum development, a curriculum is not a neutral stance either. So where do you stand and what shows up in your curriculum? Okay, fourth set of questions really. This is simply around thinking about the variety of approach that you might have when you approach religion and religions and non-religion and worldviews in your curriculum. And simply it's just this idea of balancing systematic and thematic. Dave Francis talks about in-depth studies and panoramic studies. I like that language. And the idea, in-depth obviously diving into one tradition, and then panoramic taking an issue and looking at it from two or more traditions, or maybe he talks about through the whole religious landscape. And at RE Today, we've been recommending to schools they think about doing, over a year, doing systematic, thematic, that you might study two religions in a year and then do a thematic study, which draws on your learning in the first two. So you know something about those traditions before you then try and compare. And it also helps to reinforce earlier learning, but it also means that you can apply that learning to new situations and new contexts as well. So that's just as a suggestion, really. And of course, you might need to balance local and global, and you might need to balance contemporary and historical context as well. But that brings me to the idea that when you're looking at those systematic, thematic, or however you're going to do that, that you think in terms of inquiry questions rather than topics. And I mean, I prepared this stuff before looking at your curriculums. And so none of these comments, none of these suggestions are making any particular comments about any particular curriculum. But I know some of you use inquiry questions. The advantage of inquiry questions is that they delineate the content that you might choose. If you have a topic, Islam, then where do you go? Whereas if you have a question, then it can guide you as to what content you're going to need to address that question. So that's helpful, and it also allows perhaps to get out of the strictures of the world religions paradigm. So setting up inquiry questions. Now that also ties into my next reflection really about content, which is about thinking about method. If you have questions, setting questions can also apply different methods as well. And we've heard already from Richard about disciplinary. He mentioned the Freethie work, Robin Giles Freethie's work, back from 2014, the RE Searcher stuff from Exeter. Been thinking about the disciplinary approaches. I know many of you know the Norfolk syllabus, and several of you in the room involved in developing the ways of knowing that Richard's talked about already, which incorporates and encompasses disciplinary knowledge. And I know that you'll be aware as well of the work that Fiona and I have been doing with the Big Questions in Classrooms project, which is trying to look at how you might apply disciplinary methods to content. There's a sneak preview of book 4 for the secondaries there, Studying Religion, coming out in January. We're just doing all the design proofreading at the moment. Now, I know that lots of teachers have been using disciplines and disciplinary approaches before, but I think what's changing really is their transparent use, the deliberate use in the classroom, and making it more visible for pupils. And so the question for you is whether your curriculum does make it explicit about what approach you are taking and what difference it makes. So, for example, you might wonder whether your pupils recognise the difference between what it means to explore, a worldview which sees truth as revealed by the divine, right? A sort of supernatural origin for this. And what does it mean to explore a worldview that sees religion, and therefore non-religion as well, as social constructs like music or art or politics? So how do they weigh up those two different approaches? Or do they merge within a unit or across units as well? I mean, what matters to people within both of those worldviews? If one sees divine supernatural origins for traditions, and one sees naturalistic origins emerging from human culture, then how would you handle and explore them differently? So for the first one, you might use methods from what you might broadly call theology, textual study, including different voices on gender and race and reading from the global south. You might apply philosophical methods to go for clarity of meaning, clarity of terminology, clarity of argument as well. You might think about ethics as well. And for that second approach, you might use methods from within religious studies, which of course encompasses sociology and anthropology and psychology and other social sciences. You might explore, do sociological surveys. You might look at a material religion. You might look at a ritual and myth. Maybe you do ethnographic study as well. You use some ethnographic models, observations, interviews. And with older pupils, maybe you do feminist perspectives, post-colonial identity perspectives too. Now, I think what the shift towards clarity on methods is doing is it reminds us that we are not handing over some platonic ideal of knowledge to pupils that is sort of perfectly formed, brought from on high in the glorious glowing textbook that is handed over to pupils. We're not producing this perfect knowledge. What we're doing is inviting pupils in to the process by which that knowledge is brought into being. That we're bringing them into this to say, well, look, this is how it's brought about. This is how people discuss it. This is how people develop this knowledge. It's bringing pupils in on that conversation. Now, this also then gives us a chance to think about the right kinds of questions to evaluate the knowledge. And Rich has talked about testing the generalizations. Christine was talking last night about the grounds on which pupils are going to analyze and evaluate. One of the things we've been doing in our Big Questions in Classroom series is thinking about, are there particular kinds of questions you might ask for different kinds of knowledge? So some of you will recognize we've had some disciplinary experts, and Carissa talked in stuff about psychology. You might ask some of these questions. Is this survey, for example, is this research study, is it reliable? Are the questions appropriate? Are the words that are used easy to understand, or could they be misinterpreted? That's the first level of evaluation. Second is, when we take that study, is it replicable? Can you take it from this group that was studied and apply it to a different group? So you could take it from a study that's done over here, and does it work with your pupils, for example? And then is it generalizable? Can you take the results of that from this group here and say, I can make some generalized statements about all people from there? Okay, in terms of theology, we're talking with Simeon Zal, our theologian, Christian theologian, using actually some of the questions that Richard put in Mark Chater's book. The questions are, when you look at the theological knowledge, is it coherent within itself? Is it faithful to the Christian tradition, the Christian traditions? Is it significant for adherents or believers within the tradition? And does it have significance outside it as well? And then Rachel Shillito, our sociologist, are the survey methods or the methods you're using consistent? Are you using them in the same way? Are there patterns that you can discern when you look at the data that comes out of this? And then when you look at the interpretations, are you saying there's only one way of interpreting this data, or are you allowing the possibility for more? So there's that possibility of being deliberate about those different disciplinary perspectives and evaluating it. I think also you might think as well about these two ways of viewing religion as supernatural or natural, looking at both of those from the perspective of organized official teachings and the lived experience as well. Okay, so sixth. Now, my first job, I was head of RE in an 11 to 16 school. It had limited provision for RE before I got there, and they were supportive of it, so that's good because the only way is up. At least I hoped that was the case. And I had the head teacher and the deputy head teacher as non-specialists in my department. I mean, they never came to my department meetings, but they were there. But what I did, my final assignment actually on my PGC, which was here in Birmingham with Mike Grimmett, my final assignment was to create a Key Stage 3 curriculum. So I was writing it for this school. Actually, when I tried to put it into practice, it was rather idealized, I have to say. But when I arrived at the school, I'd written lesson plans for the first term, and I handed them over to the head and the deputy. Lesson plans, resources, everything they need. They absolutely loved it. Right, and each lesson they could pick it up and they could just do it, and they loved it. And to be honest, they loved me as well. By the end of the year, I got you got the incremental pay rise, but I got an additional increment pay rise from them as well. I'm sure it's just I bribed them with lesson plans. When I was actually teaching my own classes, apart from the fact it was a demanding school that had some challenges. When I was trying to teach these lessons, I got to lesson 2 and I was beginning to have some misgivings. And lesson 3, it was just like, this really isn't quite working because some of my pupils haven't got lesson 1 yet. I can't be moving on to lesson 4. And so, I mean, this was really helpful to learn early on when I started to think, actually, no, I've got to think more flexibly about this. And so I'm going to make just a suggestion, which is about thinking outside the tyranny of having to do everything in 60-minute, if you're lucky, or 45-minute blocks. Now, I hesitate to make this suggestion because, I recognize there's more scope in primary, isn't there, for expanding, maybe doing an RE afternoon, or even an RE day or an RE week. It's much more difficult in secondary to break out of that. And also, many of you will have non-specialist teachers who want something that they can just pick up, and so if you write really good lesson plans, that can be really helpful. I'm also aware, that Christine Council put up, six lessons in the curriculum as well. And it's all in lessons. So I'd give this with hesitation, but I wonder whether just being clear about what it is where you want to reach, where you want pupils to get to, and giving yourself a bit of time to get there, as opposed to thinking, I've got this rigid structure, if you like, this rigid set of lesson plans that I've got to stick to. I think if seeing that might just help, just give a bit of breath, really. Okay, that was 6 questions and then one comment, a final comment. Some of you will remember Howard Gardner, who was multiple intelligences. So you don't hear about Howard Gardner anymore because that idea was so discredited in terms of education. But I think there's some of the stuff that he's written that's got some helpful things to say. So Lynn Meltzer's book on executive function, I was looking at it because we were doing stuff on neuroscience and executive function, the brain and learning, and I came across this essay by Sina Moran and Howard Gardner. He talks about Hill, skill, and will. Now, this is not quite about curriculum, but I'm going to say it anyway in my last minute. And he talks about you need Hill, skill, and will. Hill, you need to so teaching is about establishing a clear goal, right? And this applies to curriculum as well as your lessons, as well as your units of study. Clear goal, and actually the pitch of the hill will depend on the class you've got and the school you're in, and actually it'll depend on which year it is as well. And actually sometimes it might depend on whether it's Friday afternoon or it's Monday morning. So it's setting a hill, right? You're being clear about what you want to do. Now this is their language, the skill. You're then going to enable pupils to climb that hill, right? And that includes knowledge as well, doesn't it? It's not just skills here. So what knowledge do they need to be able to climb that hill? Okay, now that's fine. I think we recognise this. But one of the things that talk about curriculum doesn't talk about enough, I think, is this third element, that you need pupils to be able to want to go up the hill with you. The volition to begin and persevere until a goal has been reached. Now, I mean, you can have the most wonderfully coherent curriculum, but it can founder on the rocks of classroom reality, can't it? And particularly those of you who teach in difficult schools, right? It can just, brilliant ideas comes up against a wall. So you need to think in your curriculum, it needs to reflect your own context. What is going to win over your pupils? What's going to enable them to have the will to climb that hill? And so, I mean, I can't tell you what it is for each of you. And Christine talks about the content needs to do the engaging. So it's not about doing dancing at the front of your classroom to get them to learn, but the content should draw them in. Of course, our subject is fantastic. It has such fantastic content that can draw pupils in. But we need to think about that. And of course, that's the art of teaching that goes beyond curriculum as well, but I think it's part of curriculum. So curriculum isn't a theoretical construct. Okay, it is about reality, and it has to deal with the reality of your situation as well. Okay, 7 reflections. I hope they're helpful.